Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video which covers the strengths and weaknesses of Freud's psychodynamic theory, which is part of the psychology of the individual topic for the Stage 2 psychology course. So let's get started. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the strengths of Freud's psychodynamic theory and the weaknesses of Freud's psychodynamic theory. Let's start with the strengths. So it was the underlying basis of psychotherapy and talking therapies which still exist today. So we know from going through this topic and watching my other videos that Freud started talking therapy with psychoanalysis. So he would listen to every single word that the client said and came up with his theories regarding ID, ego, superego, conscious, preconscious, unconscious, defense mechanisms, and of course the psychosexual stages based on his talking therapy. Now, we know that there's obvious validity and reliability issues there. I'll talk about that more so later when we cover weaknesses. But Freud was the first to really pioneer talking therapies at all. And we know how important that is in psychology, which obviously still exists today, as I've said there. So we obviously have cognitive behavior therapy, intrapersonal therapy, and other talking therapies, which are absolutely vital in the treatment of mental illnesses. And also personality disorders, which we'll talk about in a separate video later on. But if it wasn't for Freud's theory and his psychoanalysis development, we wouldn't be where we are today necessarily with talking therapies, or if we are, we may not be as advanced. So it's because of Freud's theory that we have the basis of talking therapies, and we know the importance of it through many, many years of research and development. It was also further theories were built from Freud's initial ideas. So Freud was the first person to come up with any theory whatsoever regarding personality and personality development. Now, again, further theories have been built and have been made which are more robust, but if it wasn't for Freud's theories on personality at all, who knows where we would be today in terms of what we do know about personality and its development, similar to what I talked about previously with talking therapies. It was the first collective theory of personality and the notion of the unconscious mind. So again, we had to start somewhere, and Freud was brave enough to do that for his time, especially given the controversial nature of different parts of his theory. So it was the first collective theory, and many people still agree with it and believe there is some merit to it. Now, it's impossible to test. Again, I'll talk about that later on. But a lot of people still agree with his theories or think that there may be something to them. Which is obviously their choice. And again, it was the first collective theory, so we've got Freud to thank for that. Now, it is still very popular today in mainstream media especially, particularly in film and television. So even though this was developed obviously several years ago, it is still referred to today. It's still very popular. It's obviously still taught, all right, for obvious reasons. And there's a lot of references to Freud's theory in mainstream media, particularly film and television, like I said before. So there's a lot of characters that are very obviously linked to parts of Freud's theory. So, for example, a lot of characters may have an unusual close relationship with their mother or their father. That is obviously linked to the phallic stage of psychosexual stages. It might be that a particular character is very talkative or very over the top and dramatic, so that would mean an oral fixation. It might be that certain characters are very evil and very selfish. That would link itself to being ID dominant, and so on and so forth. So a lot of characters in film and television today can be very easily linked or explained using Freud's psychodynamic theory or parts of them. So it's still very popular. It's still discussed at length, which is excellent for psychology in general. However, scientifically, there's a lot of weaknesses of Freud's psychodynamic theory. It is far too subjective to be empirically tested. There is absolutely no way that even if ethics were thrown out the window, that we could accurately test this on a large sample of the population and come up with conclusions. It's too subjective to be empirically tested. There's absolutely no way that we can prove that the psychosexual stages actually exist and that there is an ID, ego, and superego. Yes, it's a theory. It may explain certain phenomena and certain behaviors, but there's no way to scientifically test this on a large amount of the population in order to come to that conclusion in a scientific way. Also, just putting aside the obvious, it's far too unethical to do that. So there's no way that, well, all of Freud's theory can be scientifically proven. So most of his conclusions were based on case studies, therefore we cannot generalize to wider populations. Some of you might be thinking, yeah, okay, so that part of the theory relates to this person or relates to this character. That may be true, but we can't make generalizations. We can't generalize it to everybody, in other words. And scientifically, we know that that's a problem. Okay, so it also implies that personality is biologically deterministic, so it completely excludes social and cultural factors. So Freud believed, again, that we are born with our ID. We know this, all right? So he really implied that most of our personality we are born with, and it's biologically determined. It doesn't take into consideration any other explanations for personality, such as social and cultural factors that often have a huge impact on our personality as we get older. It doesn't really explain that and excludes that. Now, that's kind of expected, obviously, for the time that Freud was alive and the time that this theory was proposed. But by modern day standards, that's a huge problem, and it's very limiting in that respect. It also has a very narrow focus on sex. So there's a lot of explanations and a lot of focus on, sex and the erogenous zones, especially the psychosexual stages, obviously. And it really doesn't lend itself to other explanations as to why a child or an adult might be behaving the way that they do. So Freud, as we know, would obviously, for an example, say, oh, if someone is biting their nails, it means they were orally fixated and got stimulation from being in the oral stage of development. Well, it might actually be medically they needed to, babies need to chew on things because they are teething. Okay, so it doesn't actually take into account reality of the situation, and it's got too much focus on sex being the main dominant force behind personality, which obviously isn't the case. There's other explanations that can determine behavior now that we've done more research and we've gone through more personality theories that we will cover in other videos. So yes, it definitely has its strengths. It's very popular. It was the first theory and it was the foundation of talking therapies. Definitely credit where it's due. However, scientifically, we cannot make conclusions on it. It's too subjective. We cannot test this in any way, shape, or form, both ethically and unethically. It's just impossible to prove. It implies that our personality is biologically determined. We know that some of it may be, but it's not solely biologically determined. We'll learn more about that as we go along. And it's got too much of a narrow focus on sex and not much else. Okay, so that is the strengths and weaknesses of this theory. Again, as I've probably said in class or you've seen in these videos, you do not have to believe in this theory. You've just got to know it. So I hope you found this video useful, gang. As always, any questions, let me know.